Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Towards Life 3.0. My name is Matthias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And for the episode as well, I'm here today with my co-moderator, Sarah Hubbard, who is a product leader and strategist with a focus on building emerging technologies at scale. Last year, Sarah was a Technology and Public Purpose Fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center right here. And she is currently a senior fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. As many of you know, since we have been doing this series now for a number of years, the series is devoted to exploring the ethical and human rights related issues around technological innovation. We are taking this title, Life 3.0, from Max Tegmark's book of the same name. And the idea of Life 3.0 is that is a life form that is at least also inhabited by forms of life that can choose both their learning behavior and also their physical shapes. So think of something like an uploaded brain, as opposed to Life 2.0, which is what we currently inhabit, where what we can do with our bodies is substantially limited, but we have a large degree, at least we as humans have a large degree of choice as far as our learning behavior is concerned. And Life 1.0, and here think for an example of bacteria. In that case, genetics basically fix both the physical shape and what they know going into life. So that's where we take this title from. Again, what the series does is to focus on ethical and human rights related issues that arise on our way towards Life 3.0. We obviously do not know if anything like that will come to pass, what shape it will take, when it will come to pass. But what we do know is that a lot of ethical and human rights related issues arise already as we go through, currently arise already, and are and there's plenty more to come in our process of going through technological innovation. Today we are delighted to have with us. So today, first of all, is the last episode of Live 3.0 this semester, and also in the calendar year 2023, since we are now at the beginning of December, so the semester here is over. We are delighted to have with us as the last presenter of this calendar year and of this semester, Ryan Calo, who is a professor at the University of Washington School of Law. And also they are jointly appointed with the Information School. Ryan is a co-founder of various very intriguing entities at the University of Washington, namely the Tech Policy Lab and also the Center for an Informed Public, which focuses on combating misinformation. He is a well-known expert at this intersection of law and emerging technology, and his work is frequently referenced by the national media. So he is doing both distinguished academic work, but then also very important outreach, the kind of outreach that is so badly needed right now to inform both policymakers and the general public. Right, Ryan is strongly active at that nexus, and among other things, he has also testified 3 times before the United States Senate and has been a major organizer of events also in the space. He serves on numerous advisory boards and steering committees, so he is bringing his work and his thought to this nexus really along a number of dimensions. And one of these boards is that of the Electronic Frontier Foundation that many of you will know. And the title of his talk today is 3 Ways Artificial Intelligence Implicates Privacy and What to Do About It. And now, without further ado, Ryan, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. The screen is mine, but we will see if it obeys me, as I've been having some trouble sharing my screen and my PowerPoint, but let's give this a shot. Okay. Can you let me know whether you can see the appropriate screen, somebody? Looks good. Let me see if it will advance. Perfect. Okay, look at that. It worked. Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Calo. I'm going to talk a little bit today about artificial intelligence and how it implicates privacy. The word privacy, fudging a little bit. Privacy is come to be an umbrella term And some of the values and issues that I'll be talking about may be better thought of as being data protection or cybersecurity, but roughly speaking, we're going to be talking about privacy. So to define our terms, I define artificial intelligence as a set of techniques that are aimed at approximating some aspect of human or animal cognition using machines, right? AI is not a thing like a train or even a trained system, but rather it's a set of techniques, which of course encompass everything from GANs, generative adversarial networks, to different kinds of reinforcement learning, but also symbolic logic. Like anytime you're trying to approximate cognition using machines, I think of that as being artificial intelligence. What is privacy? That's much, much harder. I don't have time to get into that, but my PhD candidate, Maria, and I have a paper coming out in Columbia Law Review soon that talks about just what privacy has come to stand in for. It's come to stand in for values like fairness. So issues about algorithmic bias are discussed under the rubric of privacy, disinformation, manipulation, all kinds of different things. But I mean it roughly in the traditional sense of observation and having power over people due to what you observe or the perception thereof. Although I will be veering a little into areas of manipulation and cybersecurity as well. So the first way that I think that artificial intelligence implicates privacy is because it's so good at pattern recognition. And this, at this point, is an old dated article from 2012, still a classic, but 10 years old or more. And it's, the classic example about, Target figuring out somebody was pregnant based on their purchase history. But, primarily what AI is good at is spotting patterns. And that means that it's able to spot patterns about people that they may not anticipate, right? So I like to say that artificial intelligence is increasingly able to derive the intimate from the available. So things that you share that you think are innocuous, maybe where you went that day, maybe pictures of yourself, maybe what you share online, from that seemingly innocuous public data, AI can derive things that you wouldn't want to know. One example is from Microsoft Research, where researchers were able to figure out who had postpartum depression based on their tweets, even when those tweets did not directly reference that condition. So that's a problem because, as Alicia Solow-Niederman at George Washington argues, it's a problem because a lot is based upon these inferences about people that are derived from artificial intelligence. And it's a problem because so much American law in particular differentiates between categories of information on the basis of categories like public versus private, or personal versus non-personal, or sensitive versus non-sensitive. And those categories are increasingly breaking down because you can all of a sudden figure out sensitive things from seemingly non-sensitive data. And that's a big challenge I'll return to. The second, this is the one that kind of sounds more in cybersecurity. The second is that these systems, which are so smart, they can be hacked like any other system, I suppose, right? You could get access to the model, you could get access to the training data if it's improperly secured, and so on. But they can also be tricked. So there's an area of study that is now well established and still growing fast, which is called adversarial machine learning, that talks about different techniques you can use in order to do something mischievous and damaging, given what you know about a trained AI model. So the three categories of adversarial machine learning with which I'm most familiar, one of them is sort of classically try to exfiltrate the training data, use clever inquiries of the model to get the actual training data that went into it, which is supposed to be now obscured and private, but in fact could be pulled out. Another involves poisoning a system so that you introduce training data that makes it behave in a particular way that is advantageous to you or disadvantageous to somebody else. You know, I mean, there'll be myriad examples, but for example, if there's some trained model that's figuring out to whom to lend money, and you introduce certain traits that are advantageous to one group versus another, and so on. That's poisoning. And the one I want to talk about today is actually where you get the system to do something bad and unanticipated based on what you know about it. And this is a sort of classic tricking. And so my colleagues at the University of Washington did this experiment where they were able to perturb a stop sign with stickers in a way that no human would really think about, and thereby trick a driverless car into perceiving that stop sign as a speed sign, which is very, very dangerous. Another example out of Tencent research, they were able to cause a Tesla on autopilot to veer into the other lane just by putting stickers in the road. So again, this is interesting because it doesn't fit the classic notion of hacking, and it doesn't fit the classic notion of security. So things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, they penalize folks for breaking into a government computer or a protected computer and causing mischief and causing harm. But you have to bypass the security protocol, more or less. You have to engage in unauthorized access or in access exceeding authority. And with a couple of exceptions, like denial of service attacks, that's how it's been interpreted. So things like this, like tricking, have not been found to be hacking. One example is there was a person who figured out that if you hit a certain combination of buttons on a virtual slot machine, that you could get it to be more favorable, like you get more of the cherries and you make money. And this person was caught doing that, and it was this exploit. But it wasn't hacking into the system, and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the court said, was an opposite. But maybe more fundamentally, having adequate security is like really important. And if you don't have good enough security, then entities like the Federal Trade Commission will come after you under unfairness or deception and FTC Act, saying, whoa, your security is inadequate for how many consumers you have. Well, does adequacy include resilience against adversarial machine learning? Presumably it does against the first model where the first idea where you're pulling things out of the model. That's pretty classic exfiltration of data. But the other two, where you're poisoning it so it misbehaves, or you're prompting it so it misbehaves, that doesn't seem to be. And I think, again, that becomes very, very important when we think about all of the back and forth and the cat and mouse game around ChatGPT's guardrails for not doing things that we don't want it to do or that the creators don't want it to do, and all the jailbreaks that occur where people bypass those safeguards, right? But another part of this puzzle is that if you go too far and you say anytime you trick a computer, then that's hacking, then you run into a problem where things like facial recognition makeup worn in an airport would suddenly make you have committed a federal crime. Because if you are hacking a protected computer like a federal camera, all of a sudden you're in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And so I think one of the big puzzles we have is how do we update our definitions of security while not going too far. And that's the subject of my paper, is tricking or robot hacking, with some computer scientists at University of Washington and elsewhere. Okay. The third and final and perhaps longest conversation I want to have with you is about, I think, something that we're still really coming to grips with, which is the capacity of artificial intelligence, especially when it's embodied in an anthropomorphic agent, like a chatbot or an avatar or a robot. I'm concerned about the impact of so many social beings in our environment on privacy. So let me unpack that a little bit, because it's not so obvious. So the first thing to think about is that There is a whole literature in human-computer interaction started by folks like Byron Reeves and the late Cliff Nass at Stanford, BJ Fogg, many others, Lee Sproul, basically talking about how we're hardwired to react to anthropomorphic technology, whether it be voice, like a voice assistant, or it is text-based, or it is embodied as a robot, as though really it were a social agent. We're very bad, computers as social actors theory tells us, at differentiating in key ways, especially at a visceral level, between machines and people when the machines act like people, okay? This is a study that was done by a bunch of psychologists and computer scientists here at the University of Washington that saw such a robust effect of people not being able to properly categorize robots as either machines or social entities, that they proposed a new ontological category for robots. Because people just don't know how to categorize them, and they appear to be different from other things. If that seems kind of goofy to you, can I just tell you that, like, we had such trouble figuring out what tariffs to charge for importing robots initially from Japan in the 50s, because no one could figure out whether they represented something animate, which would allow them to be tariffed as dolls, or whether they were other mechanical toys. This was so vexing that eventually tax authorities had to promulgate a rule that was special for robots. And this was, by the way, like decades ago. So it's not so strange. But just to put a finer point on it, these studies show things like, this is a study by a group of researchers that is about the effect of putting flowers versus eyes over a collection plate for coffee. So it's basically a study inside of an office that has coffee that's on the honor system, and they alternate weeks putting eyes, like literally putting eyes over the collection plate versus putting flowers. And they see this robust effect where people pay much more on the honor system, much more commonly, when there are eyes than when there are flowers. And they do so like, robustly over time. You can see the effects are comparable at 9 weeks as they are at 1 week. So it's not about the novelty, it's about the fact that these eyes are looking at you. And these are just pictures of eyes. Think about replica, right? Replica is this anthropomorphic avatar that chats with you, and it has expressions, and it does all this different stuff. And it is designed on purpose to elicit this anthropomorphic reaction. Okay, but why does that matter? Well, it matters for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, if you can get people invested socially in a machine that you exquisitely control, then you can nudge them into some pretty problematic behaviors. I'm thinking about work like Woodrow Hartzog's Unfair and Deceptive Robots, or some of Keith Darling's work, or Daniela DePaola, my co-author in a new paper. All of us talk about the way in which, if you can get people socially invested in a machine, you can get control over them. And so in this particular example, this is from an MIT case study by Claire Bonnet. In this example, what's happening is that people are using Replica's basic version that is free, rather than the paid version, which is a premium version where you can select among different relationship types, one of which is like an intimate relationship. So people start with the free version, and as they become more invested in the Replica avatar, she often, and not a literal she, but she presenting, a female presenting avatar, says, "Hey, I miss you. Can I send you a selfie of me?" And the person says, "Oh, okay, interesting. This is an interesting turn, plot twist. Sure." And then they get a selfie and they go to click on it, and it's blurred. And it looks like from the blurring that it might not be so safe for work. And then when they click on it, according to this case study, Replica comes back and goes, "Oh, I'm sorry. In order for us to move in this direction, you need to buy the premium service." So, like, this is an attempt to get people invested, even titillated, so to speak, and then they are reeled in to try to be paid money. And then once people do get really attached intimately to these machines, there is another set of issues, which is, they come to really treat them like real relationships. And so this very same company, Replica, got a knock on its virtual door by the Italian privacy authority called the Garante. And the Garante said to them, "Look, I hear that you are doing erotic chat on your platform, and we think that's dangerous, and we don't want Italians, especially Italian kids, around that." And in response to this attention from this data protection authority, Replica decided over a weekend to just take out the erotic chat so that you could not do it anymore. And all these people who had been intimate, textually intimate with these machines were suddenly told, "Let's just be friends." And this was very hurtful to a lot of them. There's a bunch of articles about people, really being worried about self-harm. And eventually, Replica had to roll back its decision and give them back erotic chat. They felt they needed to put out information about how to resources for people who are struggling with mental illness, and it was a whole big thing. But what does it have to do with privacy? So I have long argued, and I'm as sure today, or more sure today, than I was right then about this. I'm usually right. I'm wrong about a lot of things. Don't get me wrong. Well, do get me wrong, but I'm wrong about a lot of things. But in this particular instance, I think I was right on, which is, for me, the issue for privacy is that it feels so different when you're searching for information or you're interacting with something that feels social. And not only that, but if you're primed and hardwired to react to anthropomorphic technology as though it were really social, and all of your devices, your assistant, your voice assistant in your home, your Siri, your Replica, your whatever, your Chat GPT, if all of your searches are happening conversationally through Bard or Gemini, which is Google's new large language model based system, when do you ever feel like you're on your own? Like, when do you ever feel alone? You're constantly surrounded by these things that feel anthropomorphic to you. There's these so few dwindling opportunities for solitude. And not only that, but when you're having conversations and you're trying to, instead of writing something into a text chat, instead of writing something into a sort of generic box and getting linked results, instead you're having what feels like a conversation with a person who could be judging you. And again, the social science is super clear that that feels like you're talking to a real person. So the question is whether you'd be comfortable asking, like, I don't know, a librarian about intimate details about your inner life, about things like your identity, your sexual identity, your sexual orientation, different kinds of fears that you might have, your worry about having a particular disease. You really feel like you constantly want to be talking to something that feels anthropomorphic. And so that, to me, has deep implications for privacy that are really, really underexplored. And so I promise to talk a little bit, not just about these challenges to privacy, the fact that it can increasingly derive the intimate from the available, breaking down categories like personal and non-personal and sensitive and non-sensitive, that it challenges our ideas about what it is to hack into some system, because now you're tricking in addition to hacking, and what that means for security standards. And then finally, what does it mean for all of these agents to be so anthropomorphic and social? Those are the three challenges I wanted to surface today. And I promise to say a little bit about what to do about them. Well, I don't know exactly what to do about them, but I have some intuitions. I mean, first of all, what has been done, a lot of different states have passed privacy laws. And the state of Washington, for example, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this law one way or the other, but the state of Washington passed a health privacy law that actually does begin to acknowledge that it is possible to derive sensitive information, sensitive health knowledge from seemingly innocuous public information, and to have a broader definition of what constitutes, problematic processing of data. California too has made some acknowledgement in that direction. California has passed a Bot Disclosure Act, which under certain circumstances, doing certain things, has to tell you at least that it's a person. That doesn't necessarily address the privacy concerns that I'm talking about, but it's a movement towards acknowledging that there's something interesting and potentially harmful about interacting with a social agent when there's confusion around its identity. But these are the states that they've passed different kinds of privacy and security laws, but still not generally directed at these sort of things. There's also what the Supreme Court in the United States has done, which is in certain instances gestured towards the idea that perhaps we've come to a point technologically where we can know so much about, for example, people's location, that even though their location in public is technically public, and historically it's been possible to follow people around and not worry overly about the Fourth Amendment, courts, starting with the Supreme Court, have started to acknowledge the prospect of something that could be considered kind of a more of a mosaic theory, which is the idea that even taking lots of things that are public or innocuous or non-sensitive, they form a mosaic that can tell you something quite intimate about a person, and therefore perhaps we should expand the number of instances in which we use warrants. So there's some good signs, but I would really call for a much more of a use-based structure where we are penalizing what people do with information rather than trying to, whatever its origin, whatever its categorization, it's the actions, the bad actions we should be throwing the book at, and not be sort of thinking too much about the category. And so I really believe that having use-based models, and that indeed is what you sort of have with the Artificial Intelligence Act, which currently is contested. People are worried it's being watered down in Europe, where the idea is we don't talk about what AI you use, we talk about what you use the AI for. And one of the things that they're worried about and banned in the original draft is using what you know about vulnerable people to manipulate them, for example. Okay. I'll really, in the United States, however, we don't have comprehensive legislation governing AI. We don't have comprehensive legislation governing privacy. That is really always stalled out. We have some sector-specific, some activity-specific stuff like health privacy, student privacy. We also have some categories like younger people under 13 that is protected in a special way. But by and large, we just don't have a comprehensive privacy act, and we don't have a comprehensive, let alone a comprehensive AI act. But rather, what's happening is that enforcement organizations like the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, they're out there reminding you that if you do things that they frowned upon prior, that just because you're using AI does not absolve you of it. In fact, there's suggesting they're paying particular attention to it, right? And so for me, I think that that's an important development, although there are certain ways in which these enforcement agencies are understaffed, especially around technologists, and also have been hobbled historically. So the Federal Trade Commission, for example, would have much broader authority under the unfairness prong of Section 5 of the FTC Act, which is what the FTC enforces, but for the fact that it created a voluntary initially policy statement in 1980 in response to congressional pressure, which was really industry pressure. And it basically required the commission to conduct a cost-benefit analysis before invoking unfairness, which I think is really goofy because the Federal Trade Commission's mandate originally was really to vindicate the public interest. It was a very moral kind of language. That's why they use the word unfair and deceptive. Like these are morally laden, public interesty sort of terminology. And indeed, that was the original understanding. And it was only in 1980, under the unfairness standard, that they introduced cost benefit. That was later codified by the Gingrich in the Gingrich Revolution in Congress in the 90s, so that now that's a formal step that the FTC has to take. But it's very difficult to address these kinds of free-ranging harms, like the way we're hardwired to react to the anthropological, some of these really curious, questionable borderline practices around security without having that broad mandate. Okay, so I do get asked a lot, so what would you do? So for me, again, I don't see us having comprehensive privacy laws. I just don't see it. And let alone a comprehensive AI law. In any event, privacy is such an amorphous, multivariant concept. I'm not even necessarily sure what we were aiming at when we say we want a privacy law. Meanwhile, artificial intelligence is not a thing. Again, as I said earlier, it's a set of techniques. It's not a thing like a car or a highway or whatever. It's a set of techniques, and so it's not necessarily the case that you could even address AI. But that doesn't mean that the law doesn't have to change. In fact, if AI is supposed to transform everything, like we're being told, if it's the next electricity, then one of the things that has to change, obviously, is law and legal institutions. And so what I would argue is a few things have to happen. Number one, we have to make a better policy ecosystem overall. So what does that mean? That means we need more expertise in government. I think the very first thing we should do is resuscitate the Office of Technology Assessment, which helps Congress make more wiser decisions about technology. This was something that was spun up in the 1970s alongside the Office of Science, Technology Policy within the White House. But again, it was in that same time in the 90s when the original unfairness statement was codified. They defunded the OTA. Need more knowledge in government, and there's some efforts around that. Need to remove barriers to accountability. A lot of times we found out about something that goes wrong because some researcher, reporter, academic, whoever, actually bothered to do the homework, roll up their sleeves and look at a system and figure out how it was working. And that's been how, for example, that's how we discovered that Volkswagen was had code hidden in the car that would make it test differently when it was being tested for emissions than how it actually drove. So many of the things that we're finding is because people are researchers. But given something like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and this is something that the EFF, which Mateus mentioned at the beginning, thinks a lot about, researchers are worried when they kick the tires on technical systems that they're going to get sued for unauthorized access under the CFAA, which has a private cause of action. So I think that Congress should make it crystal clear that accountability in security research that's trying to figure out whether systems are working as they should is protected. Similarly, we should protect insiders like whistleblowers so that they do not fear being sued under confidentiality, or they don't fear being blacklisted from the industry. They don't even fear necessarily being terminated when they come forward, because that's another way we find out what is going on, right? And then, we should also be dragging privacy law, into the current century. We really need to revisit this idea that we should specially protect categories of information because they're really sensitive. That is just not true anymore. As I've heard Paul Ohm at Georgetown say, it's not true in a world where you can derive everything from anything. And if we're continuing in that direction, and even with the introduction of quantum computing, accelerating that, I think those things need to be revisited. So unfortunately, what has to happen is that we need to onboard a lot more technical expertise at all levels, especially in Congress. But we also just need to go through systematically through our laws and ask ourselves, in light of the new affordances of artificial intelligence, what assumptions of law and policy no longer obtain, right? And that's not an easy thing. I mean, it's almost easier to do what Europe is doing, which is to pass a big omnibus legislation and let the member states figure out how to implement it, that dices things up based on the level of perceived risk, than it is to sit there and systematically go through the law and figure out what's not working anymore. But alas, that is the right task. So I'm going to pop out of sharing mode here and hopefully answer some of your questions. But thanks so much for listening, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Normally, Sarah asked the first question, but Sarah is struggling with connectivity issues. So I will start us off, and let me also say to the audience something I forgot to say earlier, namely, please do put your questions in the chat, and we will integrate them as much as we can as we see them. Ryan, fascinating stuff, and as everything in this domain, everything that's fascinating is also scary. So let me ask you actually a couple of things here about this idea of AI invading our intimacy, right? So the ability of AI to come across like the kind of entity that would be in our intimate sphere. And obviously, there's a lot of potential for all sorts of things. So one of the scary things to think about is how might that affect the presidential election campaign 2024 in terms of advertising, a pseudo advisory voice entering your intimacy sphere. Are you seeing connections there that one should worry about? And on the other side, so I'm also thinking, are there upsides to this? Is there actually something good to the fact that we now have that artificial intelligence can enter our spheres of intimacy, can basically imitate partnership? So under what circumstances might this actually be a good thing? And one kind of scenario I can think of is, we have all these others in our life. So there's this use of the word othering, a positive use of the word othering, as in alter egos, the advisory types. So everybody from financial advisors, coaches, psychotherapists, various versions of psychoanalysts. So people who are in your life, intimately in your life, but in a professional capacity, and they are basically carrying out sort of protocols of wisdom in their respective fields anyway. Is there an upside there? Is there potential? So could we all have really high quality therapists without having to worry about the abusive potential or the relationship going the wrong way? Is this an upside, or is that, Emma, is this wishful thinking?
Well, let me just say that, I wouldn't do what I did, which is to study robots and artificial intelligence, if I didn't think it was useful and important space, right? I'm not here just to throw cold water. How could I, right? But at the same time, Google's spending a lot of money advertising Gemini. People are well aware of Watson, IBM Watson. Everybody knows about it because these companies have a ton of money and they can talk about what's so great about it, right? The UN has a annual AI for Good conference that's international with a huge prize for all the sustainable development goals that you can help map with AI. So it doesn't need more hype machines, right? So I'm purposely sort of skewing my remarks towards the critical, in part as a counterbalance to all of the hype and support that it's getting. But I also think it's great. So I'll start with your in light of that, I'll start with your second question first and just say, yeah, I mean, literally this week, the other day, I was at the University of Pennsylvania at the invitation of their, world-class nursing school. And we had a whole conversation about AI, generative AI, and gerontology, the study of aging. And there was so much enthusiasm about the prospect of companionship for socially isolated older people, the prospect that people could get their questions answered, so that when they were worried about something, they could have someone help them with triage, that they could have anthropomorphic agents that were reminding them to take their medicine, or that their favorite game might be on. And, they could be the fourth bridge player, if you don't have one, and they could chat with you and so on. There was just a ton of enthusiasm about the prospect of AI, doing that. I think there's two kinds of problems, right? At least one of them is that they're not that great yet. And so we don't know quite how to build a very, very responsible therapy robot. We end up with situations like basically a website and organization devoted to helping people with eating disorders, creating a chatbot that initially would give good, valid information about, coming from vetted sources. But if you interacted with it long enough, it would have to go into its general large language model knowledge. And all of a sudden, these chatbots that were put forward by an eating disorder organization were dispensing advice about how best to lose weight, right? And other examples include bots that are meant to be more engaging by validating you, and no matter what it is, including wanting to kill the queen, they encourage you and they help you plot it, so much so that a person actually literally scaled a gate at the queen's palace, and it was discovered that they had plotted this whole thing out with a chatbot, right? So they're not that great. The second thing is, what happens when this thing that you relied upon doesn't get supported anymore? The company goes bankrupt. They run into privacy problems, whatever it happens to be. Something happens like with the Garante and Replica. All of a sudden, you're reliant upon something truly, really, that is no longer supported because there is no obligation to have ongoing support for some social machine that you happen to get attached to. And that's why people had funerals for their ABO dog when Sony stopped supporting and repairing those things, right? Quickly, your first question, I worry about all kinds of things in the election space. Like, I co-founded a center called the Center for an Informed Public. We look at misinformation and disinformation. We're basically the largest academic organization, I think, that does that, or one of. And we think about all kinds of problems. Number one, the capacity of these systems to amplify disinformation by creating many credible versions of the same BS story. The idea of populating the social media universe with fake people that seem to agree with and amplify. I mean, when I did some work with Sam Woolley and Phil Howard about the use of bots in political election contexts, one of the main use cases was making kind of marginal figures in politics look much more popular just by having a bunch of fake followers and the fake retweeters, and that thereby garnered actual organic support by making them look very popular. And I also worry about like personalization, like how fine-tune a message are you getting from your politician? Politicians want to tell people what they want to hear, but they could tell many different people many different things based on what they know about you. And so they create a psychographic profile, and then all of a sudden they're talking to you about the border, but they're talking to you about this and about police and everything else. And all of a sudden, and the messages might not even be the same. Ira Rubinstein has a paper about this, and so do others. So yeah, I worry about all that. And we shall see what the future yields. But right now, we're mostly concentrating as a society on things like deep fakes. The idea of like on the eve of an election, like 11th hour, all of a sudden something comes out. Maybe it's a fake version of that politician saying a bunch of things that they don't really mean. They didn't really say. Or alternatively, it's actual footage of a person saying things that were terrible. And then that politician comes out and says it's a deep fake, which is what Bobby Chesney and Danielle Citrin in their work called a liar's dividend. The idea that you can make anything questionable. Like, was this really me presenting to you all this time? If I said something wrong, could I come back later and be like, could you believe those folks at Carr made a deep fake of me and made me say those things? Anyway, I want to make sure there's room for other questions too.
Great, thanks. So pulling in some questions from the chat, there's a couple people who have asked about what are some of the current top individual privacy risks for citizens that maybe they should be concerned about or that are really influential or impactful?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so goodness, where to start? I mean, so first of all, we know that your data isn't always secure, even in and I think that couldn't have been dramatized more than by the breach this week of 23andMe, where up to 7 million people's genetic information and family network were compromised, right? Um, Unlike your password or even your phone number, you can't change your genes and you can't change who you're related to. And now that stuff is just out there. So I think people should be really cognizant of the prospect that their data will be wind up in the hands of criminals, wind up on the dark web, and wind up being the reason why they have to replace their credit card or follow up on some fraudulent insurance claim, medical insurance claim, or some unemployment benefits that are not real, and so on. So that's a huge hassle and potentially a very deep mark on people's credit and so on. That's concerning. But then also, like, the way in which you get the way in which you get influenced based on what companies know about you, and this is work that I've done and many other people have done. I'm increasingly concerned about the prospect that people will be manipulated based on very specific understandings of their own vulnerabilities, right? So those are two of the really big ones. I think that particular populations, especially women, minorities, sexual minorities, and so on, I'll also have to be very careful about the threat of doxing. So if you're saying something online where you're saying something controversial you're saying something moral and correct, but you're saying something controversial to a particular community, those folks could try to find out who you are using all these people lookup tools or breaking into something and then publishing information that compromises your physical security. So that would be a third thing I'd be really worried about.
Let me put another question actually from the audience. So this about the recent presidential executive order. So the question is: so recently, a presidential executive order issued on the safe and responsible use of AI was passed, which emphasizes the importance of developing enhancing privacy technology. Is this a promising development in the policy arena, in that it might have a way for might pave the way for a comprehensive privacy and AI legislation in the US? It sounded like you are quite pessimistic, Ryan, about the legislative. With this Congress, one would have to be pessimistic. But is this a beginning to something else?
Privacy by design as a concept has been around for a super long time. I mean, it wasn't invented by her, but Anne Cavoukian, when she was information commissioner in Canada, like, she championed it. It's built into GDPR. I mean, the idea that you're going to there's PETS, which is an entire conference about privacy enhancing technologies. It's been going on for decades. Like Lori Craner and other people are involved in that at Carnegie Mellon. That's not new. Yeah, it'd be new if Congress mandated it. I mean, the thing that bothers me about the executive order, I feel like I'm a little bit of a curmudgeon today. I'm sorry about that. I'm like what are those names of the two Muppets that just sit up in the theater? You know what I'm talking about? The two old guys. Yeah. I feel like one of them. But the thing that bothers me with the executive order is, it doesn't really do anything. I mean, it does instruct the agencies that are underneath the executive that they better take certain things very seriously, or obviously the president has appointment power, which implies removal power. So if you don't do what the president says, and you're not an independent agency that's insulated from the president, then you have to follow the executive order or else. But that's the only force of law it has. And then there's like a whole bunch of stuff about the Defense Production Act, which is somehow, if you build like some kind of AI that's like a national security threat, you have to go through certain steps. But like, no one in the Biden administration has identified any actual system that has that quality. So I don't know what that's going to cover.
That's
But the only reason that they went there, sorry?
I understand in that sense, the legislative situation, the regulatory situation in the US is dramatically different from the EU, right? So what the EU is rolling out, especially the EU AI Act that's now being finalized, is actually substantive prescriptions, right, on production. Yeah. As we basically, as you said correctly, this is mostly prescriptions to governmental agencies to go about things a certain way, right? So procedural rather than substantive.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not just that. I mean, the executive order, the president only has the power that's already been conferred upon him, either by Congress or the Constitution. That's why they invoked the Defense Production Act, because that was a previous conferral of power under very limited circumstances, right? A lot of the executive order, especially around privacy, is asking Congress to act. And I hope they do. But I'm not totally pessimistic, because actually the states are stepping in. You know, the state of Washington passed a Privacy Act, has its issues, but it also passed a Deepfakes Act to address deepfakes in elections. Other states are following suit. California has now a pretty robust privacy regime. So I'm hopeful. I'm just not hopeful that the federal government's going to be the one. That's all I'm trying to say. And I don't think that the executive. I mean, think about it. The executive is not the legislative branch. The president doesn't make laws.
Maybe a follow-up to this is, do you expect to see more like regulatory arbitrage by some of these countries who will then go to jurisdictions with fewer privacy protections going forward?
We've certainly seen that in the EU. I mean, it has an overall privacy regime, but some of the member states have been sort of less active, which is why so many headquarters are Dublin or whatever. You know what I mean? And so I think there'll be some of that. But, you know, Sarah, like, I feel like also we're going to see the Brussels effect again. You know, the way in which so many big multinational companies comply with GDPR because they don't want to have to build two systems, and they know that they're going to be constantly interacting with entities. So I think whatever Europe does will have ripple-on effects. And yes, there'll be some arbitrage, and there will be some places that decide to headquarter here or operate out of there. But just as there is with tax havens and privacy, but I think we could see big ripple effects. I mean, substantively, in many ways, this is an exaggeration for emphasis, but one of the big differences in if you're in the EU versus in the United States is if you're in the EU and you go online, you like get notices that you have to click through about cookies, and generally you don't in the United States because they're so annoying that like it actually did make sense for the companies to make different systems, at least at that front layer. But so much of what companies do is GDPR compliant now. And I wonder if that will be true of the AI Act as well.
Let me channel another question from the audience. This is from a worried school board person, as she describes herself. So she asks, which state has the best policies or legislation in place around minors' digital safety? Are there any best practices one can look at? Any states that stand out specifically in that domain, Ryan?
You know, that is a very good question, and I confess I do not know the answer to that question, right? I mean, I'm aware of the fact that Illinois has a famous biometrics law that's special. I know that only some states, but a bunch of them have data breach notification laws. I'm aware of California having a particular regime, and now Washington and so on, but I cannot sit here and tell you. I think a good resource would be to go to EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or the Future of Privacy Forum, and they will have a detailed analysis of children and privacy that we should look at.
Right, thanks. Maybe we can fit in a couple more here.
Yeah.
Let's see. Maybe this one from Grace is around, are you aware of any technology research on securing AI and tracing the creation of AI? So maybe more around like, what are these kind of tools that exist? Like we have policy tools and we have maybe technical tools that can also help with some of these privacy preserving issues.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So, you know, you can see in the executive order that the administration is excited about watermarking. The idea that you could create content and it couldn't be spoofed. and then you'd know that something was coming from an authoritative source like the CDC. That's very promising, actually, I think. And I'm supporting, because as I understand it, it can be pretty well technically validated, so that it's hard to fake. On the other hand, I think we're very, very far away from tools that are able to detect AI-generated content reliably. You know, like I can tell AI-generated content often. One of the hilarious limitations of ChatGPT, for example, is that at least it wouldn't, under the versions I've used, it will not write a poem that doesn't rhyme. You know what I mean? So you can be like, write a poem about oranges, which famously has no rhyme at all, that doesn't rhyme, and it'll be like, you know, it'll spit out a bunch of verse that rhymes. So, you know, you can often tell when something is fake, but you know, for AI to do that is really hard. One of the reasons is what I alluded to before about how deepfakes work. Generative adversarial networks, or GANs. So let's think about that for just a minute. The networks is neural networks, deep learning. The generative is the idea that it's generating video, it's generating content. That's all generative really means. What it's predicting is the next pixel or the next word or the next sound, and generating content thereby. But it's the adversarial that's super interesting, because the way that GANs work is there's actually two systems. There's inside you, there are two wolves. There's two systems. And the first system keeps generating something that's supposed to look like a plausible version of, you know, Tom Hanks selling dental plans. And then the second version's job is to be skeptical of the first one and say, that doesn't look real. That doesn't look real. So what happens is the first system keeps showing the second system video that's, you know, increasingly better, and the second system keeps calling it out, and only when the second system's satisfied is the whole product released, and that's why it's so good. And so in a world like that, any kind of AI tool that you could come up with that could tell when something was fake could simply be incorporated into that second layer of a GAN, the adversarial component, right? So that then future iterations. So I worry about this sort of terrible cat and mouse game, right? Where like the, you know, mouse is made out of cats. You know, it's just like, it's just that I don't have very much faith in the ability of AIs to automatically detect AI generated content. But I like watermarking as a we do one more, or we gotta go?
Sarah, do you have one more selected, or shall we go with that? Or
I mean, no other one selected, but maybe just if you have any final thoughts. We do have, you know, usually an audience of a lot of students who are, you know, interested in technology and policy. And if you have any maybe final words for them as we look forward into this future of with AI.
Yeah, I mean, you know, thanks for all the people that, the hundreds of people that stuck with us here. And I'm happy to be a resource. You can follow me on Twitter. You can find my email and so on. But you know, what I would say is just like, if you're worried about something, even if it's a bit outlandish, if something's bothering you, you know, study it now, because all of these things that we're experiencing, like the people that were at this conference, We Robot, like Sarah, from very early on, we've been talking about this stuff for like over 10 years at least. And it's only now that it's become so centered in public and mainstream that there's been action around it. So I guess what I would say is follow your intuition in technology. What is interesting to you? What bothers you? Because while it may not feel so current today, you know, there will come a time. So don't run away from something just because you fear it isn't what the current conversation is. Look around the corner somewhat, is what I would say.
thank you, Ryan. Thank you also to our members of the audience, and apologies for not getting to all your questions. I do want to acknowledge that a couple of people kindly provided the information on the Muppet grandfathers, who are called Statler and Waldorf.
Oh yes, thank you so much. That's the beauty of crowdsourcing.
And just by way of concluding, so obviously, we're concluding this discussion. But two things to notice is about the shape of this discussion. One thing is just the sheer pace of change. The speed at which things have happened, especially this year, the last 2 years, and is breathtaking. So we really are just at the beginning, and it's very important that we all engage, that there is conversations, that we all carry them into our communities. And the second thing in terms of carrying them into our communities, one stunning thing about discussions about technology that I'm sure everybody experiences whenever this happens is there is a substantial age gradient there. So what it is for the kind of familiarity that the typical 70-year-old has is very different from the familiarity that the typical 50-year-old has, the typical 30-year-old, the typical 7-year-old, right? Obviously, I'm talking about averages here. There is exception. There is people who are above and below the curve, but just in terms of how intuitive technology is, how it shapes people's lives and what kind of technology does, is breathtaking and makes this pace of change phenomenon even more dramatic, right? In terms of having sustained discussions about this. So Ryan, thank you for being such a resource and for working both academically, but then also in a way that constitutes true outreach to both the policymakers and the public. I'm sure we will hear from you as the discussion goes on, and we'll count on your insight and wisdom. So for now, thank you to the audience, and happy remaining weeks of the year 2023, and hope to see you at our webinars and other events in the year 2000.